Well, Clark Kent gets some really appreciated panel time, and Aquaman continues taking this character where I've always wanted him to go. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I talk about DC Comics 1 week after their release on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. In each installment, I pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, full spoilers for everything I talk about. This is your first and only warning. Right now, we're taking a look at comics originally released to the Ultra tier on May 7th, 2025, and originally published April 9th, 2025. First of that group is Batman Dark Patterns number 5. This is part 2 of the Scarface story titled The Voice of the Tower, in which Scarface has taken over an apartment or a building tenement, and it is like, although the doll, the puppet has been destroyed, seemingly his essence, his personality has overtaken the whole building, and his echoing voice can be heard from directions that Batman can't quite identify, and so he is trying to stop Scarface, who is being the mastermind of a takeover of this building. Anyway, I love the concept of Scarface, especially from Batman the Animated Series in the early 90s. I found him so creepy and so interesting. But the direction that they're going here is not super exciting to me. And a lot of it has to do with a few pet peeves at this point. One of them is the way that they're having Scarface talk. Now, what I remember from the Batman Animated Series is that when you would hear Scarface speak, there was no artifacts, there was no evidence in his speech that he was being controlled by a ventriloquist. Now, ventriloquists have to do some tricky things with their tongue and with their lips in order to pull off certain types of consonants. And one of those would be the consonant B. And so anytime that Scarface says Batman, in the dialogue bubble, it's written as Gatman. As ventriloquists will kind of manipulate their tongue to simulate what sounds to the listener like a B sound, at least very briefly in passing, if you're a really good ventriloquist. But nevertheless, you're still manipulating your tongue in kind of a G, in the sense of how you would produce a G to simulate this B. But I know I'm getting really zeroed in on something here. A lot of you are going to be thinking, Peter, that you're spending way too much time talking about this. But I'm just talking about what's bothering me. So I'm being honest. This is where I'm at with this. In this dialogue bubble, he says, "Get off me, gat freak." Well, the M consonant also requires closed lips. So why is that not also being represented? Why can he pull off a really convincing M, but is totally messing up his B when they require very, very similar movement from the lips to produce those consonants? What I find annoying about it is the same thing I find annoying about a lot of dialogue written for Bizarro and Zatanna. When Zatanna's casting her spells, I mean, usually I can just get away with, I don't want to read backwards and try to figure out, okay, what is she saying? Okay, I get how that would be producing this effect because she's saying this backwards. I have just lost patience for doing that. I don't find that gimmick interesting. I find it a little cheesy, actually. And then Bizarro, with his reverse logic, every writer handles that reverse logic inconsistently from other writers. And so just hearing him talk and trying to puzzle through, okay, what does he actually mean and what is going on? It's just oh. And so this just adds a little bit of labor to reading the dialogue of Scarface in comics when he is written this way. That's just kind of that's a little bit off-putting. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about that. It's actually one of several just kind of minor things, but it is what it is. There are also there's a couple of instances where Batman is kind of made to look a little bit on the ridiculous side, or his mystique is taken away from him. And I think that I really don't like it when that's done to his character, because it's his mystique that makes him what he is. It's the illusion to criminals, at the very least, that he is a supernatural being that cannot be easily defined and understood, that makes them superstitious about him, fearful of him. If you take that away and you expose him then at some point he just looks like a ridiculous guy in a bat suit. And Batman, in my mind, must never become that. And I think that even though he's not trying to scare civilians, he should not be reduced to that in their minds either. And I think that kind of happens here in a couple of ways. In one way, reduced to another character, and in another way, slightly reduced to me as a reader. The first one, he is in the apartment of a woman that's an innocent, kind of in the mix, and he's telling her, it's okay, I won't hurt you, you don't have to be afraid of me. Her response is, you're the one on the TV running around on roofs dressed like that, helping people. I guess it looks scary if you see it in the dark, question mark. So it's like, yeah, so I guess, your outfit doesn't look that scary. You don't seem scary to me, And I'm like, all right, not really what I would prefer. And then I don't know if this is intentional or not, but a little bit later they show Batman climbing outside of that same apartment window and scaling the building. And the way he's drawn, the pose he is climbing in, it looks very much like the old Adam West scenes of the 60s Batman series, where they just turned the camera on its side and they had strings pulling at their capes, and then they created this really bad looking illusion of them climbing up a wall. And it just I don't know, maybe it was because I was primed by her disarming comment about how Batman looks in the previous scene that I just saw what looked to be another kind of disarming of the mystique that Batman normally has in this visual here. But either way, I was like, oh man, not my favorite. I like Batman to have a mystique, and even when he's protecting people, for them to still at least be a little bit nervous around him. That's my preference for Batman. On a philosophical level, I'm not sure if I'm not sure what's going on here quite yet, but he's talking to the same woman in her apartment, and he's talking about the fact that Scarface's voice is bouncing around the building and you can't really tell where it's coming from, and the psychological effect that can easily have and does seem to be having on the residents of this building. He says, we have a tendency to ascribe meaning to it, meaning this phenomenon of what is he say, a sound where the hearer can't see the source. He says it can hold power psychologically. And he says we tend to ascribe meaning to it, spiritual weight, he says. Moses hearing the voice of God in the desert. The ancient Greeks thought every cave held the voice of the lost nymph Echo. And so here, if not the writer, then at least Batman is kind of viewing the burning bush moment between Moses and Yahweh through a sort of God of the Gaps lens, meaning that, Moses misunderstood what was actually going on there, and because he couldn't explain it, because he is not intelligent or educated enough in natural sciences, then he explains it by it being a god of some kind, And I do understand that there are some people, even Christians, that have a kind of God of the Gaps mentality about certain things, but I mean, there's just, in the serious realm of debate on these topics, there's just not room for that argument in terms of like how Christian thinkers are actually looking at God and his relationship to the natural world. I mean, you can just find a bunch of great content at, say, reasonablefaith.org, put God of the Gaps into their search field, and you'll find a bunch of content responding to really this kind of straw man attack from opponents of theism. So it's a little disappointing to see Batman kind of seemingly subscribing to this mentality, and especially since we are supposed to be sympathetic with Batman and see him as reasonable. That said, we still haven't gotten to the bottom of exactly what is happening in this building. Could there actually be something supernatural going on? Well, there's hints that that's at least a possibility. The woman that he's been talking with in her apartment says regarding some voices that have been known to be heard in this building over the years, she says they're not urban myths. I've heard my dad grouching down these halls almost every Thanksgiving that I'm still drying out the turkey. Trust me, I ain't hearing it 'cause I want to. Later on, we see the reveal that Wesker, the ventriloquist, has had his tongue cut out. Now, given that he's had his tongue cut out, I think he's still a little bit more verbal than he probably should be. But even so, by the end of this issue, it's established or I think we're supposed to believe that, okay, he cannot be the one that's creating this voice. So it's got to be someone else. There is a strong hint of who that person is, but at the same time, I think there's the possibility that this story could play out to reveal that there is some kind of an actual supernatural source to what is going on in this building. Now, on the one hand, I would appreciate that, because then it would show that Batman's overly simplistic God of the Gaps view of say the story of Moses would be unwarranted. But at the same time, I don't really want the ventriloquist to go to a supernatural place in terms of his concept, and I don't even really like it when Batman is dealing with supernatural foes. So either way, I don't know that I'm going to be all that happy with where this story is going at this point. So again, that's Batman Dark Patterns number 5. Then next up, we've got Fire and Ice When Hell Freezes Over. And this is, I guess, a new ongoing series about the characters Fire and Ice now that the events of Absolute Power have swapped their abilities so that Ice now has Fire's fire powers and Fire now has Ice's ice powers. And the book just seems like it's too whimsical and cartoony and lighthearted. There's almost nothing of actual real consequence that would require superheroes. I'm not really into superhero stories that are just about superheroes going through their daily lives and occasionally using their superpowers in fairly pedestrian ways. The idea of superheroes is appealing to me because there are real major wrongs in the world, and it's very satisfying to read about those wrongs being righted by someone, or having a power fantasy, about someone that rights wrongs and overcomes horrible evils and threats and stuff like that. So this seems like it's just going to be way too whimsical. At the same time, it also seems weirdly demographic-y, box-checky. In terms of just the different people and demographics being represented here. The writing doesn't seem interested at this point in making Fire and Ice into like a lesbian relationship, which I half wonder. I mean, these characters are known, from my limited experience, admittedly, with them, to be just really good girl friends. But I mean, I wonder, well, today, would that be taken in a different direction? Doesn't seem like that's going to be the case, but like, B or Fire walks into a bar, and the guy that's running running the bar at the counter is in a wheelchair. It's like, okay, so check there, and that would be nothing. Any of these things would be nothing by themselves. But then, like, you've got an ape character with no identifiable signs of being female. I guess, you could say, well, it's an ape, so maybe that would be hard anyway. But it does have like a purple strand of hair in front. I guess this is someone from the Grodd mythos of characters. I'm not sure what's going on there, but they kind of almost go out of their way to identify this character as a female character, which, given their appearance, I was just really, really confused about. Maybe I'm reading too deep into this, but even so, anytime the color purple shows up, it seems statistically more likely that there's going to be some kind of like LGBTQ plus themes. I haven't done a study on this. I don't have any numbers to crunch and to present to you, but it's weirdly anecdotal in my life. But anyway, this character that physically is not presenting as female at all, but has this purple hair thing and is being referred to as female. Like, okay, is this kind of like meant to represent a trans character in some way? I'm not sure. And I'm like, okay, Pater, you're too sensitive. You're reading too deep in it. There's probably nothing there. But then this guy sitting down for a haircut, because all of this takes place in a salon. If things couldn't be tame and inconsequential enough, he says to the woman who's cutting his hair, who happens to be black, he says, "Hey, my friend ever mentioned this area was so diverse, though. Very cool, very, very cool." And she's a little confused, like, thanks. And then he takes a selfie with him and the woman cutting his hair with hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Girl Magic, hashtag support Black-owned businesses. He keeps using the word black in conversation with her, that you should open a place in Metropolis. A black hair place would do real good there. She says, "Why do you keep saying black?" And he's like, "Oh, sorry, would you prefer African American?" And she says, "I would prefer to be treated like a person and not some status symbol for your performative wokeness." So at this point, I'm like, okay. Even if I can't yet read the writer's diary and know where they're landing on all the various political issues, this is clear to me that this is going to be a politically charged in some way book. That's how this is shaping up at the beginning. Even if it doesn't, like, in a really preachy way, take one side, which I don't know that it necessarily will, but these ideas, these topics are just already bubbling up quite a lot to the surface. Anyway, I briefly looked up after just seeing these little elements in the story, briefly looked up the writer. Last name is Sterer, can't remember her first name, but on her own website, it describes her as having a unique brand of comedy with a conscience. I'm like, okay, so this is a person that I can expect will write a very lighthearted, quote-unquote comedic. I say that not as an insult, but because I hardly laugh at anything that other people find funny. But that is going to have some kind of messaging according to her values, whatever they may be. And it's like, okay, I think odds are I'm not going to like this one. So I do not plan on reading another issue of Fire and Ice when hell freezes over. But now we get to some books that I at least enjoyed reading. I don't have much to say about Green Lantern Corps number 3, although it does continue establishing the connection between John Stewart and Shayera, the Thanagarian policewoman or whatever her background is. I can't remember. The Hawks get a little bit confusing to me. But we do have a big moment where Thanagar, which was like destroyed in the last issue, and we discover that it has this massive core of nth metal that it's made of. Well, that nth metal comes to life in this issue and is revealed to be the mythical god of the Thanagarians, Horus. And then it nearly destroys them for, I don't know, awakening it or being blasphemous or something like that. Shayera convinces it not to, and that if it'll just leave them alone, that she will tell the surviving Thanagarians of its peace and its honor and all that kind of stuff. And so it's really interesting to see where in the world that's going to go. Horus flies off, and John and Shayera are kind of like just the survivors of this, having a moment of connection. I don't know if this relationship is going to continue to develop going forward, but like I said last time when I talked about an issue of this series, I am curious, I am interested in seeing, okay, where could they take that, given that relationship was played with in the early 2000s Justice League animated series. This issue also touches on Atrocitus. Well, more than touches on it. He's a main character. And the Red Lanterns, who have basically been dissolved because of the destruction of their central power battery, which has been happening all over the DC universe. All these central power batteries are being destroyed, leaving the Green Lanterns with a lot of messes to clean up and things to figure out as these emotional powers are running havoc all over the place, running amok. Well, this issue does end with Atrocitus being captured and putting in a science cell like the prisons on Oa and put into like a cryostasis. I hope, though, that this is just a minor, a brief settling down or quieting down of the Red Lanterns. I don't want a DC universe where the Red Lanterns don't exist. I think there's some interesting things to be done there. But for now, it seems like that's somewhat buttoned up. Anyway, so again, that's Green Lantern Corps number 3. Then we get to one of two books that I really found enjoyable and special this week, and that's Action Comics 1085. And the main reason I enjoyed this, at first I was put off, because it was like, this takes place before such and such events, before Absolute Power. I'm like, before Absolute Power? So in continuity, this took place in publishing time over a year ago? Why should I care? They had an uphill battle to make me care about this. But I really enjoyed it because Lois is in a bind, needs Clark to finish up a story that she can't finish up herself. And so he goes on a trip to investigate this thing in the Arctic and goes as Clark Kent. Initially because, wanting to, I guess, kind of take a little bit of time off. But I just love how throughout this issue, especially like the first half of the issue, he is Clark Kent the whole time. We see Clark Kent at the Daily Planet, then Clark Kent on the plane that took him to the Arctic research base, and then Clark Kent at the research base before things kind of hit the fan with a mysterious bad guy that he's got to turn into Superman to deal with. But all the way up until that point, he was so consistently being Clark Kent, like the meek, mild-mannered, cowardly, Clark Kent that I really prefer. I don't like Clark Kent when he's a GQ model. I like him when he's a little bit nervous and timid, and it really seems to others to be a coward. I really like that Clark Kent. I think it ties more closely to the original power fantasy that Superman was always meant to be. Jerry Siegel said in an interview years ago that in his conception of Superman, he reflected on the fact that he was kind of meek and mild himself, and a lot of girls didn't notice him, but what if he was really amazing and they just didn't realize it? And that's where the idea of Superman came from. And so, and where superheroes with secret identities all come from this idea of Superman. And yet portrayals of Superman have been neglecting this core aspect of the fantasy of the concept in comics, surprisingly, and less surprisingly, but still just as disappointingly, in other mediums for many years. You'll see bits of it here and there, but nothing like they leaned into it in, say, the Christopher Reeve movies, really leaning into him being a nerd. Yes, I think that Superman would be a different type of nerd today, but certainly a Clark Kent that is timid, socially awkward, introverted, insecure, nervous around other people would be such a delight, and I think it would really be a wonderful way to explore that kind of fantasy of who Superman is and why, especially in his early decades, I think people found him so interesting and appealing. I think it's because of that dual identity fantasy. Well, anyway, he was so locked into playing as Clark Kent that he almost had me convinced. I was like, is this during a time where he had temporarily lost his powers? But because even when he would seemingly be talking to just Lois in the Daily Planet newsroom, he was kind of keeping up some of this act and being scared by Lois when she would come up behind him and stuff. Or when he was on the plane, and it's just him and the pilot, because it's a small plane. The pilot's looking ahead at, his view while flying, and Clark is in the back, kind of jittering and shaking and getting queasy and stuff like that. I'm like, wow, he's really committed to the point that has this performance in play so that at any moment, should the pilot turn around, or in the newsroom, if anyone should be happening to look his way, even if he thinks no one else is, he is still committed to the role of Clark Kent while there's even a chance that anyone would be looking at him. And I really like that. I think that kind of Clark Kent, I would love to see it so much more often. So I'm very interested to see where this little story is going to end up in the pages of Action Comics. But because of the treatment of Clark Kent, I like my comic of the week maybe is Action Comics 1085. Really appreciated what was going on there. Finally, in Aquaman number 4, we're just continuing to see Arthur learn to use his new water telekinesis powers. This time he breaks out of some bindings that were tied to some really dense wood, I guess, that he wasn't going to be able to break out of. I'm like, in hindsight, I'm like, isn't Aquaman strong enough? Well, maybe he was in a weakened state. I guess he'd been unconscious and been through the ringer for a little while. So maybe, I'll assume it was that. But anyway, he makes the wood more brittle by drawing the water out of it, and then he's able to break it. And I'm just hungry and greedy for more and more of these kinds of creative applications of his hydrokinesis. I want his abilities with water manipulation to become like Wally's abilities with Speed Force manipulation. I think there is so much potential for Aquaman, and it really seems like, once again, Jeremy Adams has been reading my diary and is putting some of my dreams into action in his writing. So really appreciate this. I also appreciate at the beginning of this issue, there's kind of a flashback or it turns out to be kind of a dream sequence where Arthur is thinking of or dreaming of his wife Mara, remembering how they met, and just kind of establishing just how head over heels in love he is with his wife and the way he views her. And Adams has done this with, at least a couple of characters now, where he establishes that the relationship in a marriage is not this tired, boring thing, but like in a healthy marriage, there is still just like sparkles in each other's eyes now and then when you look at your spouse and you think, oh man, I am so grateful to be married to this person, you know? And Adams really kind of captures that in different ways in his writing. He did that a number of times with Wally West. I think in some ways he's setting up Hal and Carol to potentially be that. And certainly I was reminded of his strength in this area in the opening pages of Aquaman #4. So love what he's doing with the character, love what he's doing with Arthur's love and commitment to his family and his concern for their safety, including their son, which I'm trying to remember. Oh, did they still have a baby? How long have they had that baby? Has it been, I'm trying to think, is this maybe the one child that has not been aged up somehow in comics? I don't even remember the status of their baby because I've just not been following Aquaman consistently. But man, if they still have a baby, that if someone's going to let that baby stay a baby, I think it's going to be Jeremy Adams, which I think would be awesome. Anyway, we'll see what happens as Aquaman continues. But certainly Action Comics this week, Aquaman this week, even some of Green Lantern Corps this week, leave me feeling hopeful for the future of what's coming in some of the comics I'm reading, which is why for my weekly ring selection I have chosen the blue ring representing hope this week. But I think those are all of my thoughts on comic books for now. As always, would love to get your thoughts about any of the comics I mentioned, any comics that I didn't. You can leave those in the comments below. Then, as always, I hope you'll check out christiangeekcentral.com. Tons of content for you there, including a podcast version of this content if you'd like it that way. All made for you as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.